Welcome to another episode of Bitfinex Talks. I'm your host, Ricardo Martinez. Today, my guest is Samson Mow, CEO of Jan3. Samson, how are you today?
I'm good, Ricardo. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Samson, the reason I asked you to come on the show is because you have been extremely busy undertaking the goal of nation state adoption for Bitcoin. You kind of started out in El Salvador, and we've seen the progress that El Salvador has made as far as making Bitcoin legal tender, coming out with the securities law for altcoins and stuff like that. Recently, you've been in the headlines because you traveled to Costa Rica and more recently to Mexico. My first question for you is, what is nation state adoption, and how do you feel that it fits in with the hyper-Bitcoinization narrative?
Nation-state Bitcoin adoption is simply when a country decides to embrace Bitcoin. And they can do this in a number of ways. So we've seen a lot of examples in the past few years. We've seen El Salvador come out with Bitcoin as legal tender. Prospera in Honduras has also made Bitcoin legal tender. Madeira, the president of Madeira came to Miami last year, and they announced that they would be adopting Bitcoin. Now, they're an autonomous region of Portugal, so they cannot have their own monetary laws, but they're looking to embrace and adopt Bitcoin on their own level and doing it in their own way. So basically, every country has their own way to adopt Bitcoin. Some countries have a simpler path forward. They can simply recognize Bitcoin as foreign currency. For example, Guatemala, they have a law called divisas, which they don't need to change their legal structure or anything. They just simply need to acknowledge that Bitcoin is a foreign currency, which it is. It's the currency of El Salvador. So they would just need to simply say, either the regulator, the central bank, or president, just say Bitcoin is foreign currency. It's usable in Guatemala. It's that simple. So you also have city-states adopting Bitcoin too. As you know, Lugano is a big proponent of Bitcoin. The mayor there, Michel Folletti, he's been doing a lot of work with Paulo and the team to roll out Bitcoin adoption in that city. So there's a lot of ways that cities, states, and any region can adopt Bitcoin. And that's something that we hope to push forward at Gen3.
A lot of like the more diehard Bitcoin maximalists, kind of cypherpunk Bitcoiners, kind of criticize this push of nation state adoption. They would rather see like grassroots from the bottom up adoption. What would you say to people who are critical of a government kind of imposing Bitcoin from the top down?
Well, I think the grassroots adoption is needed. So we've seen these initiatives fail when there is no grassroots support. And I think you need both things. So without the nation state level adoption, without some change in the laws or legal structure, it is difficult for more mainstream adoption of Bitcoin. So grassroots initiatives can flourish, of course, but there are usually laws that limit the adoption of Bitcoin in some form or fashion. So for example, capital gains. By making Bitcoin legal tender, there is no cap gains on Bitcoin, which means it is simply money. And these types of changes simply won't happen without engagement at the government level or with governments and politicians. So I think it's important to have both. We like to support both. We like to support the grassroots initiative, Bitcoin Beach, Bitcoin Jungle, et cetera, but we also think it's worth reaching out to government officials and politicians and educating them about what Bitcoin is and how it fits into the grander scheme of things. And I think these two initiatives together lets us accelerate hyper-Bitcoinization and faster adoption of Bitcoin.
Your most recent trip was to Mexico. I understand you met with a bunch of government officials, the pro-Bitcoin congresswoman, Indira Kempis. How did your trip go? Can you talk about it at all?
Yeah, I would say it's a success. We didn't have the expectation that we'd have this many meetings, but there was a great deal of interest in Bitcoin. So the genesis of the trip was Senator Indira Kempis invited me to go and speak at Congress and talk about Bitcoin. And then a few other Bitcoiners on the ground, Manuel and Andres, they started lining up additional meetings through their network. So it became a bigger trip than we thought it would be originally. And we had a number of meetings. We met with politicians from every party. We met with Senator Astorga. He is the chair of the Treasury Committee. So that was a pretty important meeting. But there were a lot of meetings, and I would say there's a lot of interest in Bitcoin. And it's just a matter of time now. But I would just preface that with, things will take time because you have to educate a lot of people from nearly nothing, right? You have to explain all the workings of Bitcoin, how it plays in with the economy, what it is technologically, the potential economic benefits, and of course, you have to address a lot of the FUD. There are concerns about Bitcoin, and some of those are very old concerns that date back numerous years just from what the mainstream media is saying.
What do the Mexican officials like? What's their opinion on El Salvador? Like, how are they viewing El Salvador's current experiment?
They're definitely interested in what's happening there, and I like to frame it to them like, if Bitcoin can do this for a small country of 6 million, what could it do for your country? So Mexico, I think, is 200 something million. It would have a far larger impact. But I try to bring it down to what it directly would do for them rather than talk too much about El Salvador, just so that we can relate to what they're concerned about, right? And one of the things that Mexico, and at least in Deer Compass and people I talk to, are concerned about is the banking of the unbanked or financial inclusion. So I like to talk about how Bitcoin can solve that problem, because the only reason you have unbanked is because there is a two-tiered financial system. Either you're allowed to use it or not allowed to use it. It kind of breaks down to that level, right? So Bitcoin being permissionless and simply information, it allows anybody to access the financial system. And I think this is an important thing for them to bring to the table, because there's 60 some odd million Mexicans that are not connected to the financial system in any way. And the only way to fix that is with Bitcoin, right? Because if they could have fixed it with getting people bank accounts, they would have done that. If it could have been fixed with the CBDC, they could have also fixed it with just traditional banking access, but it's not that simple, right? So at the end of the day, Bitcoin is the only way to solve this this problem and bring people into the financial system and get them included.
What about Costa Rica? You were also in Costa Rica, and you kind of did the same thing you did in Mexico, where you met with a bunch of government representatives and stuff like that. Are they bullish on Bitcoin, or are they still kind of reserved?
I would still say it's early, and the discussions are still quite basic. We're not, going into the depths of the rabbit hole just yet, but it is encouraging. We met with ISE, their national utility as well, and that was probably one of the more interesting discussions we had, because they're opening up to the idea of mining using their excess energy. And as you know, Costa Rica has a lot of excess hydropower, and they're planning to expand their hydropower production capabilities as well for the next few years. I think they need to double essentially the entire hydropower production grid of Costa Rica in just a few years' time. So we talked to them about expanding on those mining initiatives. They're working with one data center, one mining facility called Data Center Plus, by this gentleman called Eduardo. And this is essentially their pilot project. They had to curtail and shut down hydro plants, but simply that was due to lack of demand for energy during the COVID crisis, or the COVID plan. But this Bitcoin mining basically let this data center, this mining farm, continue to operate. So what they would do is just mine Bitcoin and sell that. And I think ISE caught on to that, and they're starting to understand that there is this massive transformation right now, which is that energy is money. So you don't need to necessarily send that energy somewhere else and transmit it to your neighbor and sell it to your neighbor. You can simply use it, turn it into Bitcoin, and sell the Bitcoin. And I think this is very interesting for them, because they have still additional hydro plants that have been shut down, and they could potentially reopen those. But Bitcoin can help them stabilize their grid too, by introducing a base level demand across the board. But I think this is also interesting for the government as well, because if they need to expand their energy production, then Bitcoin mining and these public-private types of ventures could be a way for them to access capital, or even doing something like a Bitcoin bond in this case, it would be a hydro bond. So they could raise a lot of capital using digital securities, like the volcano token in El Salvador. And they could use that to buy Bitcoin and finance the infrastructure build out and mining build out.
You mentioned that Costa Rica is very interested in mining because they have a lot of surplus energy and a lot of renewable energy. What about Mexico? Did Mexico, the officials in Mexico, like express interest in making a hospitable climate for the mining industry? I know their digital asset law is kind of restrictive, I guess, in regards to like Bitcoin regulation. What about mining?
Well, I don't think they've passed it yet. They did have some digital asset law, but it's tabled for now. That's my understanding. But when we brought it up, it was an interesting point. But again, I just want to put the disclaimer out there that these are early discussions still. But there was definitely a lot of interest in the potential for what this could do for Mexico, because Mexico is also energy rich. They probably have a far different mix of energy than Costa Rica, but they're still very energy rich. So it's just a choice if they want to tap into that and use it for something like a Bitcoin bond or to mine for themselves. But I would say different countries probably have different avenues to Bitcoin adoption. Some countries can do a Bitcoin type law more easily than others. Costa Rica, I think the way there is to start with simply mining because the national utility is already familiar with it and they already have a pilot project. So it's simply a matter of expanding upon that. For Mexico, I'm not sure if mining would be the simplest way in the door. That's why when I spoke at the Mexican Senate, I gave them 3 points. And my first point was simply buy Bitcoin and store it as a treasury asset, because I think that would be the simpler way to go. But there are other ways that we can adopt Bitcoin. So in Mexico, the municipalities actually have a great deal of autonomy. So we're talking with some of those Bitcoiners on the ground to roll out a plan there to engage with some of those municipalities. But potentially it could be a municipality mining Bitcoin before Mexico proper is mining Bitcoin.
After visiting El Salvador and then also making these missions to Mexico and Costa Rica, what differences have you noticed in like the attitudes towards adoption? Obviously, El Salvador is way ahead when it comes to the levels of adoption, but like how would you characterize the differences between the three nation states and their progress in adopting Bitcoin?
Well, the bigger the country is, the slower they're likely to move. It's just how it works, right? So I would say the level of interest in Costa Rica and Mexico is similar, but in Mexico, you have the benefit of Indira Campus that is really pushing that agenda and talking about Bitcoin often, right? So far, we don't have a politician in Costa Rica yet that is doing that, but I think that's going to come. But Costa Rica is able to move faster, I believe, and they have an avenue to do so with their national utility. So it's likely they could be a faster mover. But there are other countries interested to do this type of hydro bond. We've been talking to some people in Ecuador as well. So the question is, who's going to get to be first to do a hydro bond? It could be Costa Rica. It could be Ecuador.
With Costa Rica's proximity to El Salvador, would you say that they have like a more positive view of what's going on in El Salvador as far as adoption goes, or would you say that they're kind of like Mexico, where they're watching it from afar and they're interested, but they may or may not be positive yet?
Well, I don't think proximity is necessarily that important, but I just think for Costa Rica, it's definitely easier for them to do so simply because they have the energy, excess energy. Mexico, the energy system is a bit more complex. And also Mexico has a very strong central bank with anti-Bitcoin inclinations. So we'll have to see how it goes there. That's why I think it'll be harder for Mexico. Simply it's bigger, more established, and there's going to be a lot more mechanisms that are going to be hindering adoption, like the central bank there. But we'll have to see. Like, this is one of the things that we're looking at. What can Mexico do to hold Bitcoin without the necessary approval of the central bank? Or can it be framed that this is simply a commodity and the central bank can hold this commodity? And it's not about Bitcoin legal tender, but simply keeping Bitcoin as an asset. But I think in terms of proximity to El Salvador, Guatemala seems very ripe to me for Bitcoin adoption, both because the proximity to El Salvador, but also because of the inclinations towards using Bitcoin and the ease at which they can actually implement something due to their foreign currency law.
Both Costa Rica and Guatemala have circular Bitcoin economy projects. There's Bitcoin Lake in Guatemala, and then there's also Bitcoin Jungle in Costa Rica. Did you actually visit Guatemala, or just
Yeah.
Costa Rica? Oh, okay. Did you get a chance to
Not
make
on
it
this
to
trip,
either?
but at Tixan, I didn't get a chance to go. I had a very short trip, so I went to Guatemala last year, I think, and it was to meet with the central bank and other politicians, but I didn't get a chance to go to the lake. The problem is, like,
Okay.
a lot of these Bitcoin locations are a bit far away. Like the Bitcoin Jungle, I did get to go, but it was a bit of a stretch to get out there, right? We had to take a helicopter in order to make our schedule work. But all of these little Bitcoin adoption hubs are kind of far away from the main city. But I would just say one comment there about the term circular economy. So this is something I think I coined in like 2017. And I feel like these days it's being misused a little bit. So when I first started talking about circular economies, it was about the Lightning Network. And I would say the Lightning Network enables Bitcoin circular economies. And this is a term that's originating from recycling, basically. So it's that you're using things and then you finish using it and you recycle it and it gets repurposed and you use it again. So when I was talking about Bitcoin circular economies, I was thinking that you would be able to earn and spend Bitcoin. But if it's an economy that's simply accepting Bitcoin and they're converting it to dollars, or if they're simply hodling it, then it's not really a circular economy. It's a circular economy if these merchants that have adopted Bitcoin are then spending at other merchants too, and they're paying their workers in Bitcoin, right? You're halfway there if you get simply merchant acceptance, but the way that I see people talking about today, it's just a conflation of merchant adoption with a circular economy. But to have a real circular economy, they need to pay their workers. Their workers got to pay their rent, and then they have to buy their groceries and everything in Bitcoin too.
How would you compare like Bitcoin Jungle to Bitcoin Beach, for instance?
It's hard to say. I mean, they're very different animals. Um, Bitcoin Jungle, I think it's more merchant focused, I guess. Bitcoin Beach just has a more uh, surfer friendly vibe. It's like a community, whereas Bitcoin Jungle, it feels more like it's just a lot of merchants adopting Bitcoin simply because they need to take in money from a lot of the tourists and the foreigners living there. So it's more of a practicality in some way. But Bitcoin Beach has definitely got more of a community vibe and hanging out and talking about Bitcoin.
I was kind of curious. Do you think that Bitcoin Jungle could potentially like gain traction the way Bitcoin Beach did and kind of influence Costa Rica's like Bitcoin policy in the same way that Bitcoin Beach did in El Salvador?
Definitely. I mean, the government is aware that it exists, and I think some of them have gone to try it out and test the payments and experiment with it. But I would say all of these grassroots initiatives play a big part in the nation state adoption because it's a proof of concept that this works. It can be scaled up, and it keeps them honest from going into things like shitcoins. So I think it's good. In the Central African Republic, it was purely a top-down approach, and then that failed pretty badly. So there was no on-the-ground community. Some of the Bitcoiners went there, and they found that it was just a top-level thing. Like the government said, Bitcoin legal tender, and then they did the Sango coin, but there was actually no usage on the ground of Bitcoin. So that's kind of why they're able to fail. But these kind of communities sort of allow you to be anchored to Bitcoin, right? They're Bitcoin communities and they're Bitcoin economies. So they kind of keep you honest.
Outside of Bitcoin Jungle or Bitcoin Beach, how would you say like in Mexico and Costa Rica, like the level of adoption is? Is there places that you can actually use Bitcoin because you have a chance to spend it anywhere? Like how did you see that?
Yeah, so I visited the Bitcoin embassy in Mexico, and they've been taking Bitcoin as payment for quite some time. So I bought a drink there. And I would say in Mexico, there is not like a branded thing like Bitcoin Beach or Bitcoin Jungle or Bitcoin Lake. but there's a massive amount of people using Bitcoin in Mexico. It's kind of odd. Like, you probably have more people using Bitcoin in Mexico for payments than either other country with those communities, but they just don't have this this package brand. And I think that's interesting. It says something about Mexico, but and the opportunity for Bitcoin adoption in Mexico. But I would say it's probably in tens of thousands of people, maybe upwards of that, just using Bitcoin on a daily basis.
In a lot of other Latin American countries, there's not really like access to exchanges. I don't know if like AML KYC is a barrier or if it's regulatory barriers that are stopping the exchanges from coming into the countries. And that results in like a huge peer-to-peer market. In Costa Rica and Mexico, do you know, like, I know Mexico has Bitso, but do people use exchanges or are they buying mostly like in a peer-to-peer fashion?
I think Mexico, a lot of people just use Bitso, but also the peer-to-peer options too. But I think peer-to-peer is probably going to be the dominant form of Bitcoin exchange in LATAM, simply because it's already an established norm. And like you said, there are barriers to big exchanges operating. And I think peer-to-peer is better too, because it's more in the Bitcoin ethos, because it's about transacting directly with another person without using a third party. So I think this is probably the way it's going to expand in LATAM. We're just going to see more peer-to-peer apps and peer-to-peer exchanges popping up over time to serve that market. And it's probably healthier too. It's better for the ecosystem because there's no risk of paper Bitcoin being printed with peer-to-peer exchange.
You mentioned Central African Republic and the failure of Bitcoin adoption. You also mentioned Ecuador as being another possible place that could adopt Bitcoin on a nation state level. How do you, it seems like Latin America is kind of leading the way. How do you see like other nations in Africa or Asia or other like developing emerging economy type areas in their adoption level or potential for adoption, I guess I'd say?
So, I mean, as a company, as Jan3, we're interested to support countries around the world and Bitcoiners in all these countries to work on that nation state adoption. The work we do is not possible without people on the ground everywhere. We need those boots on the ground to make introductions, make connections, and we're keen to support all these initiatives. I think we have a call, our Director of Operations is lining up a call with the Mano project in Ethiopia next week. We haven't had a sync with them some time, so we have to touch base again. But I would say the bulk of our focus right now is simply in LATAM because it's so ripe for adoption. You have the perfect storm of conditions. You have these Bitcoin communities on the ground. You have already countries looking at Bitcoin in terms of policy. Bitcoin is becoming a topic for politicians as they're working towards re-election as part of their platform, and they have to discuss about it. And we're also trying to push that issue too as a key topic. But yeah, LATAM, it simply has a lot of need. It has all the right conditions. It has a lot of need too. If you look at countries like Venezuela, Argentina, there's a large tract of adoption of Bitcoin and stable coins like Tether too. It's very commonly used as a medium of exchange and a unit of account. So I think there's this perfect storm brewing in LATAM. So I think that ends up drawing us there, and that makes it the bulk of our focus. But we are trying to work with communities around the world, everywhere, to push this nation-state adoption.
I know the focus for you guys and nation-state adoption has been more like in the developing world, but recently, Gary Gensler of the SEC went on TV and was getting grilled by Congress about crypto, and it seems like there's like this Operation Choke Point where like the U.S. authorities are kind of trying to cut the on and off ramps to crypto companies in the fiat world. And it seems kind of like Europe is following this kind of regulatory stance to make it more restrictive. Do you see any hope in the West for nation state adoption?
Yeah, that's a good question. It does seem a bit futile to work on that, but there are groups in the U.S. actively trying to push for Bitcoin adoption, and there are senators in the U.S. Cynthia Lummis is one of them, that are seemingly voices of reason in this pool of chaos and confusion. But for the most part, it's challenging, and I would say it will be challenging until it's suddenly not challenging. So they're going to not embrace Bitcoin. They're going to try to put forth archaic, backwards thinking regulations, you know, limiting mining or rationing energy to miners or banning self-hosted wallets. They're going to do all these things until one day they suddenly can't, because Bitcoin is information. You can't really stop information. Even in China, where information is tightly locked down, they still have very low rates of adoption of their CBDC. So it's inevitable that we're going to move to a Bitcoin standard simply because Bitcoin is information, right? You can talk about all the other parts of Bitcoin, like 21 million cap, et cetera, but at the end of the day, Bitcoin is information. You can remember the words, you can write them down on a piece of paper, you can send a transaction over radio, over Blockstream satellite, whatever you want. Information is super porous, so it cannot be stopped. And if it cannot be stopped, then people will use it because portability is one of the most important parts of what makes money money. So they'll try to do these things, but ultimately they'll fail. And when it fails, you'll have a violent snap back to Bitcoin adoption. And I think at that time we'll start to pay more attention to Europe and other countries in the West that will be keen to adopt Bitcoin.
Now that El Salvador's passed their digital securities law, I guess it kind of paves the way forward for the volcano token, the volcano bond. You mentioned that Ecuador and Costa Rica are both interested in a hydroelectric bond. Would both of those be kind of like similar to the volcano bond, I guess, like a mining revenue, tokenized security kind of investment?
It could be, but I've done a lot of thinking about the structure of the Bitcoin bond since I first designed it in 2011, and the world has changed a lot too. Recently, I've been thinking maybe it doesn't need to be a token, right? You could do a traditional bond vehicle and still do that Bitcoin bond issuance. Of course, the tokenization and digitization of it is going to be a benefit because then you have things like 24 trading, peer-to-peer trading, if it's done on Liquid, and the dividend payouts would be able to be a lot smaller, right? You can pay out in USDT over Liquid network and it would just cost a few cents. And the whole system that Blockstream built around that, Blockstream AMP, would enable that to be done very, very easily. So there are a lot of benefits, but if the digital securities component is a hindrance and it's challenging to get off the ground, I've been thinking you could just do it as a traditional instrument and still accomplish your goals, right? You can still do the coupon payouts through traditional means. You could still do a lot of it and not have to push for digital security. So it's really up to what the countries want to do. They could push for a digital securities framework, or they could create an entity in El Salvador and domicile that entity issuing in there and use the Salvadoran digital securities laws. But at the end of the day, the goal is start doing something with Bitcoin, accumulate a large war chest of Bitcoin, and start mining Bitcoin. So if the digital securities component is a blocker, then just do it the old-fashioned way, but you'll still get the benefits.
As far as El Salvador's volcano bond, is like how soon can you guess or estimate that we could see it become a reality, or is it still kind of like got a lot of red tape surrounding it?
Well, as you mentioned, they passed the laws already, so they can do that issuance. I believe it would be the Ministry of Finance, or at least originally that was the plan. But it's been a long time, and I haven't talked to them about what their plans are, so I can't really comment to that. But they seem to have all the building blocks ready. Bitfinex Securities has a license now, and it seems to be ready to go. But I would say the design of the bond probably has to be redone because it's 2 years old now. And it also depends on what their energy infrastructure looks like. They wanted to do geothermal mining, and last I looked, like they needed a few years to build up some of that infrastructure still and get more geothermal power online. So I'm really not sure what the state of the situation is right now and when they could do it, but it probably needs to be relooked at, or someone's probably doing that already.
Samson, is there anything that I haven't asked you about nation state adoption that you feel is important for everyone to know?
Maybe we can talk about how to help Jan 3 and how to get involved.
Yeah, please do.
That comes up. Yeah, that comes up from time to time. Like Bitcoiners on the ground are saying, how could we help? And you just have to reach out. Ultimately, democratic governments are supposed to be representative of the people, right? So you should be able to talk to your local politicians and network. And everyone is 6 degrees apart. So it's not hard to get some contact that knows somebody in the government, maybe a minister of finance or energy or something like that, and see if you can arrange a meeting. And you can tell them that you have friends doing this company called Jan3 and working on nation state adoption, and we can arrange meetings and we can support that. So you can look at us as a resource. We are here to help you talk to people and provide information, how-to guides, and just answer questions about Bitcoin and talk about what we're doing in other places as well. So we're a pool of resource and information at your disposal.
Samson, if people do want to reach out to you, how would they do so? Can you give us the website, the social media that they could follow, and all that good stuff?
Yep. So my Twitter is @Exelion. I'm pretty backed up on my DMs right now, but I'm working through that. If you @ me publicly, I'll probably see that more. Like there's more high of a chance I'll see that. And then if you @ Jan3Com or DM them, then someone will get back to you because we have a team behind that handle. And our website is jan3.com, which is not launched yet, but it's coming very soon, and there will be more information there.
Well, Samson, thank you so much for coming on the show and explaining nation state adoption to us.
Thanks, Ricardo. It's been fun.